हाय फ्रेंड्स। आज 6 सितंबर है। आज का न्यूज़ आर्टिकल्स हिंदू न्यूज़पेपर से देख लेते हैं। पहला है G20 भारत रिप्लेसेस इंडिया इन G20 इनवाइट फ्रॉम प्रेसिडेंट। टाइम टू डिसाइड द केस फॉर इलेक्शन इन जम्मू एंड कश्मीर, कोप इन Gabon, the implications of the expansion of BRICS, decoding the Nyaya Sanhita bill, laws governing forest of the Northeast region, Indo-Pacific China map on agenda as PM leaves for Jakarta. Modi, Biden to hold bilateral talks on Friday at White House. पेज नंबर 13 का है ये। शी जिनपिंग skipping G20 summit a deliberate signal to India, according to West. India and Bharat interchangeable, can be used in official invite, says legal expert. How two CJI How two CJIs 4 years apart had dealt differently with pleas for the names, but for the name Bharat. In second action by iStrack, Aditya L1 enters new orbit, page 14. Myanmar won't be allowed to lead ASEAN in 2026 in blow to generals. Then FM flags threats to financial system from crypto tax haven. Criminalizing wildful environmental damage is harder than it sounds. साइंस का पेज है ये। तो पहला जो आर्टिकल है हमारा, भारत रिप्लेसेस इंडिया इन G20 इनवाइट फ्रॉम प्रेसिडेंट। Government sources deny plan to formalize only one name for country during special session of Parliament. Opposition says BJP is afraid of India. Ruling party leaders welcome use of Bharat. Invitation sent by President Draupadi Murmu to the heads of states and governments and the Chief Minister of Indian states for an official banquet on the occasion of G20 summit in New Delhi created a flutter as the word India was replaced with Bharat. Instead of the usual President of India, the invitation cards said President of Bharat. The opposition questioned the reasons for change, while ministers and leaders of the ruling party welcomed the move. Government sources told the Hindu that the word Bharat will be used more and more in the coming months for official communications. BJP National Secretary Sambit Patra posted on X, formerly Twitter, the cover of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's function notes for his two-day visit to Indonesia to attend the ASEAN India Summit, which referred to him as Prime Minister of Bharat, Opposition leader alleged that the shift to the name Bharat instead of India in communication was a way to prevent the India bloc from being identified with the country's name. Government sources told that all talk of a formal action in the special session of Parliament to change the name of India was rubbish. It is clearly stated in the constitution that India, that is Bharat, is a union of states. So where is there any need for any change? A senior union minister said. The India bloc of parties have tried to reduce the identity of the country to their alliance, which is not good, and therefore the use of the name Bharat both as the decolonizing nomenclature and to bring the name of the country out of this reductive exercise was required, the minister said. Though taking a nuanced position that the names India and Bharat were both mentioned in the constitution, the Congress accused Prime Minister Narendra Modi of restoring to politics of divide. Mr. Modi can continue to distort history and divide India, that is Bharat, that is a union of states, but we will not be deterred. Congress General Secretary Jairam Ramesh said in a post on X. BJP leaders held the change of name in official communication. Assam Chief Minister Himanta Biswa Sarma posted on X, Republic of Bharat, happy and proud that our civilization is marching ahead boldly towards Amrit Kal. Then next जो है time to decide. Infrastructure development in the hills cannot be same as in plains. The destruction wreaked by the floods in North India in August has evoked concern at the highest level. Last month, a bench headed by Chief Justice of India D.Y. Chandrachud has suggested that an expert committee conduct a complete and comprehensive study on carrying capacity of the Himalayan region. Following this, the center has proposed setting up a 13-member technical committee. Carrying capacity is a concept derived from population biology and general refers to the quantity of a species that can thrive sustainably in a defined ecosystem. Generally, population exceeding capacity will lead to a natural decline in numbers as witnessed when grassland or overgrazed or invasive species throttle existing biome. Applying these ideas in the context of hill station and Himalayan states, the challenge is between balancing rising population infrastructure needs and precarious geography is bound to be a challenging enterprise. Going by recent history, it is unlikely that a interested scientific opinion will be palatable to every stakeholder in the Himalayan states following the devastating floods in Uttarakhand in 2013. The Supreme Court had appointed a committee of experts to evaluate the role of hydropower project in the state. While the committee's report did influence a reduction in the proposed hydro projects, they failed to restrict road widening projects and the carving of mountainside in ways that were deemed unsuitable for the topography. The latest proposal by the center is not new. As far back as 2020, it had circulated among the 13 Himalayan states guidelines to access the carrying capacity of their hill stations, cities, and eco-sensitive zones. The Environment Ministry had in the had in May reminded all the states to undertake such a study and submit them as early as possible. The crisis of land subsidence experienced in the Josimath, Uttarakhand in January had also sparked a debate on the conflict between infrastructural development and ecology. But in a matter of months, Himachal Pradesh saw an unexpected deluge, washing away roads and highways built on the denuding mountains. More committees and reports will not change the reality that infrastructure development in the hills cannot be executed as in the plains. Either states must bear the higher cost that comes from buildings more sustainably and minimizing the risk to denizens or designate regions as no-go zone. The latter has for decades provided fertile ground for political opportunism. Equivocal scientific evidence concludes the option to kick the proverbial can down the road no longer exists. तो नेक्स्ट का है द केस फॉर इलेक्शन सॉरी the case for elections in Jammu and Kashmir. The case for election in Jammu and Kashmir. The Narendra Modi administration recent announcement of a committee to look into simultaneous state and union election indicates that Jammu and Kashmir is unlikely to go to the polls anytime soon, despite assurances that the administration is ready whenever the Election Commission of India decides. Meanwhile, the Election Commission of India remains bafflingly silent through Jammu and Kashmir's chief electoral officer has stated that Panchayat, municipal and Lok Sabha elections will all be held this financial year. If those elections can be held, why not assembly elections? The reasons cannot be security. Panchayat elections have to be conducted on a much larger scale as they involve over 30,000 posts. In March 2023, a delegation of 13 political parties led by Farooq Abdullah of the National Conference met Election Commission of India officials to urge that assembly election dates be fixed. Any further delays, their memorandum said, would amount to denial of fundamental and democratic rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir and a breach of constitutional obligations. The delegations was assured that its request would be considered, but no action has been taken to date. This distortion of representation, Jammu and Kashmir has not held legislative elections for the past nine years. The last assembly election was in 2014, and the last elected administration fell in June 2018 after almost a year of a president's rule. The Jammu and Kashmir Recognition Act 2019 divided the state into two union territory like the National Capital Territory of Delhi. Jammu and Kashmir is entitled to an elected assembly with curtailed powers. For example, law and order remained with the Union Home Ministry and security with the Lieutenant Governor. Ladakh is not the ostensible reason for election delay was Recognition Act requirement of a fresh delimitation of constituencies following their expansion to 114 from 107. Jammu and Kashmir's delimitations had earlier been frozen till 2026 in tandem with the other Indian states. In 2019, it was added to force other states to be delimited. The process was later postponed for the four other states, leaving only Jammu and Kashmir. The Delimitation Commission submitted its final report in May 2022. Its recommendations raised two concerns. It gave six of seven new seats to Jammu and only one to the Valley, derogating from the democratic principle of equal representation. With 56.15% of the erstwhile state's population, the valley was allocated 47 seats as compared to Jammu's 43 with 43.85% of the population. Former state finance minister Hasib Hasib Drabu likened the award to waiting Kashmir's voter at 0.882. Jammu's one. The Commission's rearrangement of political constituency concentrated minority voters in fewer districts or spread them across multiple districts, vitiating their vote share. In Jammu division, for example, Hindu majority Pedar with a population of just over 50,000 was allotted as an assembly seats, while thrice as numerous Muslim majority Surankote was not. Former Chief Minister Mehbooba Mufti called it a tactical process of rigging before the election. Changes in residency rule further skewed constituency balance. Prior to 2019, non-permanent residents were not eligible to vote in assembly election after the reading down of Article 370 and withdrawal of Article 35A, and any person ordinarily resident in the former state became eligible to vote, including any person resident for more than 15 years, any person who had studied there for more than 7 years, and any person registered as a migrant by the Relief and Rehabilitation Commissioner. Migrants. As a result, a staggering 7.7 lakh new voters. Net figures after accounting for the deletion of 4 lakh voters were added to the existing voter pool of 78.4 lakh, pitting one against the other. Proposed fresh reservation will further narrow the number of seats available in the general category and or expand competition within reserved categories of four new bills proposed by Union Law Ministry. The Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Amendment Bill 2023 reserves two seats for Kashmiri migrants, one woman and one for people displaced from Pakistan held territory of Jammu and Kashmir. All three seats are to be filled by nominees of the Lieutenant Governor. The second bill, the Constitution Jammu and Kashmir Scheduled Tribes Orders Amendment Bill 2023 includes the Pahari community and a handful of small tribes in Jammu and Kashmir's list of scheduled tribe Pahadis will now be able to contest resort seats which were previously dominated by Gujars and Bakrwals. The most affected areas will be the Pir Panjal range along the line of control with Pakistan, which includes Rajouri and Poonch, where Paharis are in a majority in 7 out of 8 assembly segments. It has 4 seats reserved for scheduled tribes. The third bill, the Constitution Jammu and Kashmir Scheduled Caste Order Amendment Bill 2023 includes the Valmiki community, earlier considered a non-permanent resident in Jammu and Kashmir's list of scheduled caste. The fourth, the Jammu and Kashmir Reservation Amendment Bill 2023 adds 15 more other backward classes, OBCs, including West Pakistan refugees and Gurkhas. The electoral impacts of these two bills will also be mostly in Jammu, which has the largest number of scheduled caste and OBCs at face value. There can be little objection to these provisions. Effectively, it is another matter. Pandit migrants have been elected without reservation for decades, even during the insurgency and after their exodus. They do not need reserved seats, they need security. When elected, Gujars accept Pahadi's reservation if it does not cut into their quota, but have received no assurance of that. Long-term residents such as refugees, Gurkhas and Valmikis should be entitled to vote, but does the former require a reserved seat? Given these gaps, the bills risk entrenching caste and community-based voter polarization in a region of many castes and communities. Division versus confidence building. Successive report from the ground suggest that alienation has spread across the former state. In Muslim majority areas, people note that the number of their representatives will shrink. In Jammu, they suspect that fresh reservations are directed towards creating new support for the Bharatiya Janata Party, where the party is fading. In Kashmir, Home Minister Amit Shah's repeated attacks on the political leaders and repeated assertion that future legislations will emerge from panchayats signal that the union administration seeks a supplicant legislator despite their peers. Most people now desire a speedy assembly election. The unilateralism, nepotism, and inaccessibility of Jammu and Kashmir centrally directed administration has led to higher than even unemployment and loss of land and resource right leading even supporters of August 2019 actions to believe they will do better with elected representatives, especially since statehood only he restored after elections. According to Mr. Shah, meanwhile, a welter of discontent is brewing in Ladakh, where the powers of the elected Hills Council have been fighted to Pune by the Lieutenant Governor's office. Here too, the demand for the statehood is gaining ground. Holding an assembly election before the year end can build confidence as prior experience shows. The Atal Bihari Vajpayee administration held election in 2002 at a time when insurgency had taken a heavy toll, but that election urged in 12 years of peace building with two free and fair elections. By contrast, the attempt to rig the 1987 election led to over a decade of armed conflict. The lesson is plain to see for all but the internationally blind. Then COP in Gabon. African nations are facing pressure from risk-taking generals. In July, when the pro-Western regime of President Mohammad Bazoum was toppled in Niger in a military coup, regional powers and the West took a tough position against the Pushtis, an ultimatum to restore democracy in the West. In the West country, several countries in Africa, including Sudan, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, have witnessed coups in recent months, and the ease with which the general have seized power in all these countries have set a dangerous trend across the continent. But the new rulers of the Niger dismissed the Western ultimatum. Within a month, another regime in Africa was toppled, this time resource rich Gabon. In the case of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, all affected by Islamist militancy, the military promised better security and economic opportunity and managed to consolidate power rather quickly. In Gabon, the Republican Guard, a unit of the armed forces whose job was to protect the president, moved to seize the power after the incumbent Ali Bongo was declared the winner of the disputed election. Mr. Bongo, who came to power in 2009, was a close French ally like his father Umar Bongo, who ruled the country for nearly 42 years. Ali Bongo's attempt to preserve the only rich country's reserve forest, which covers 90% of Gabon, earned him international applause, but at home he never managed to fill his father's shoes. Gabon, and OPEC member, is one of the richest countries of Africa in terms of per capita income. Yet over a third of its 2.4 million people live in the poverty, and 40% of those between 15 and 24 years are unemployed, according to the World Bank. When Omar Bongo was in power, the regime got French protection in return for business favors, but early Bongo's regime came under systemic pressure, with the opposition demanding free and fair elections and economic equity. The military, probably emboldened by the successful coups elsewhere in the continent, seized on public resentment. Following the coup announcement, thousands were in the streets of Libreville celebrating. Whether the Putschists have public support or not, these coups speak of two major trends in Africa. First, traditional regimes are coming under increased pressure from within. A generation of risk-taking generals are marking swift moves to grab powers. This could turn out to be a transborder threat to elections, regime stability, and order. Second, the COPs also reflect the continent's changing geopolitical dynamics. All these countries were former French colonies. In Mali and Burkina Faso, the Russians have expanded their reach after the COP. Gabon has already replaced France with China as its most important trading partner, and the Western calls upon the Pushchers to go back to the barracks have predictably fallen on deaf ears. Then the implications of the expansion of BRICS. The implication of the expansion of BRICS. In August 24, the 15th BRICS summit in Johannesburg announced that the five-member grouping Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa had invited six new members: Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, UAE from West Asia, Egypt and Ethiopia from Africa, and Argentina from Latin America. It was reported that 40 countries have shown interest in BRICS membership, with 22 having submitted formal applications. From 2009, BRICS has met annually at summit level and is backed by several ministerial and export conclave. It has spawned two major institutions, the New Development Bank (NBD) to provide development assistance and a contingent reserve arrangement that supports countries facing short-term balance of payment pressures. The NBD has already financed 96 projects valued at a $33 billion. Dissatisfaction with the West-dominated international institutions that had emerged after the Second World War, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the United Nations and its various bodies, particularly the Security Council and more recently the World Trade Organization at Johannesburg. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres described them as reflecting yesterday's world. The United States has led the Western alliance in both the political and economic areas. BRICS challenges this West-led world order. It promotes intra-BRICS economic and political cooperation, builds institutions outside Western control, and agitations robustly for wide-ranging reform to accommodate the presence and interest of emerging economies. The Johannesburg Declaration categorically asserts that the members' strategic partnership will be directed at achieving a more representative, fairer international border. The recent expansion of BRICS members has shaped a grouping that is aligned in terms of global perceptions and interests, and collectively provides considerable economic clout to the enlarged conclave. With the proposed expansion, BRICS will have 46% of world population, while its share of global GDP will go from 31.5% in PPP term to 37%, far ahead of GDP of the GDP to of 30.7% of G7. The five core members account for 23% of the global exports and 19% of global imports. With the new members, these figures will be boosted by 3.7% and 3% respectively. The major impact will be on the energy sector. Out of global oil production of about 90 million barrel per day MBD MBD million barrel per day. In 2022, the earlier five BRICS members had accounted for 20% of global output. This will go to 42%, an addition of geostrategic value. The new BRICS members will bring considerable strategic value to the grouping. Those from West Asia are already closely tied to BRICS members. 35% of Saudi oil production goes to China and India. Russia, already a major oil supplier to China and India, is now looking at Brazil as a market. Despite sanctions by the United States, Iran has increased oil production from a low of 4 lakh barrel per day in the Trump period to 2.2 MBD in August this year. Most of it's going to China. Egypt and Ethiopia are an important presence in the strategically important Horn of Africa and Red Sea, while Argentina is the second largest economy in Latin America. Rather than the Rather than look at the issue being raised at BRICS summit and other meetings, Western commentators have disparaged the grouping as having so no shared vision and being a talks of criticism have little substance. BRICS leaders have met over 15 years and every time have overcome their internal division and competition to issue a consensual declaration. Over the years, the declaration have expanded the expanded in content, focused on specific deliverable, and have steadily expanded their areas of interest. In the Johannesburg Declaration, while several paragraphs call for wide-ranging reforms in international organizations, the bulk of the document focuses on BRICS cooperation and outreach to the other developing countries. Thus, members have agreed to encouraging the use of local currencies in the internal trade and financial transactions between BRICS and other trading partners. The declaration also reflects the shared view of its members on several political issues. The centrally of the United Nations, the problems in West Asia, that is Syria, Yemen, Palestine, the Arab Peace Initiative, and the Iran nuclear agreement, the war in Ukraine, and global terror. Outlook for regional and global affairs. The new BRICS members, particularly those from West Asia, naturally fit into this political and economic framework. From 2020, both Saudi Arabia and UAE have soured of the US UK and shaped independent foreign policy paths for themselves. Saudi Arabia has pursued de-escalations and dialogue, ending the Qatar blockade in January 2021, engaging with Turkey, and opening interaction with Iran from April 2021. These regional engagements culminated in the China brokered accord with Iran in March this year. The UAE has also normalized its ties with Iran and is focusing on expanding its maritime footprints across the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, and the Horn of Africa. Iran's entry into BRICS is prosperous in that, besides its role in the energy sector, it opens up opportunities for accelerated regional economic cooperation. Beside the revival of the moribund north-south connectivity project through the Chabahar port, with which India is associated, while Western writers continue to harp on the emerging global binary divide and the new Cold War. India and other BRICS members reject this short-sighted view and insist on asserting their strategic autonomy in a multipolar world order, with member nations demanding that their voices be heard and their interests respected. It is not surprising then that a recent member media report described the Johannesburg summit at a turning point in the modern history. Then next जो है decoding the न्याय संहिता bill. The government, by introducing in Lok Sabha three penal bills which is says aim to decolonize the Indian justice system, has rightly exercised its prerogatives. Earlier governments had deterred over this move for years. However, in matters of lawmaking and reform, more initiatives may not be sufficient. In this case, we need to particularly focus on 3 points. The first is that penal lawmaking and reform are serious issues which require deep deliberation and empirical validations. Second, we must keep in mind the diversity of consideration of substantive and procedural law, and engage with the two sets separately. Since substantively, laws govern how people behave, they define criminal offences and specify punishment, whereas procedural law are aimed at enforcement agencies that are to provide safeguards and due process even to the worst offenders. Third, we need to realize that penal laws are an instrument for actualizing and propagating a wide variety of interests as per the constitutional vision and the dominant ideologies, which interests need protection and priority is a matter of democratic process. In views of these issues, let us analyze the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita Bill. Participation from the people. The colonial penal law had held to be replaced not because it was inherently flawed but because it lacked participation from the very people from whom it was meant. There is an imposition of foreign ideas and values. Therefore, a wide and diverse debate that includes the participation of government should be integral to this exercise. Thomas Babington Macaulay had said in the House of Commons in 1833 that the basis of a uniform code of laws for India should be uniformity. When you can have it, diversity where you must have it, but in all cases, certainly the ensuing penal law the ensuing penal law should be aimed at achieving the target of equal and uniform application and should be structured in precise terms to the impact maximum certainty. The idea of according justice or nyaya may be the ultimate end, but every kind of criminalization means encroachment on liberties and decimations of freedom. This task requires empirically analyzing the shift in the perception of those types of behavior that are considered undesirable or otherwise. We have recently witnessed such a shift in respect to attempted suicide which from an offence under section 309 of the Indian Penal Code is on the way to becoming a mental problem under section 115 clause 1 of the Mental Health Care Act 2007. 17. Likewise, in Joseph Sain v. Union of India, the Supreme Court struck down section 497 offense of adultery. Therefore, there is a need to conduct a wide-ranging social audit of what constitutes undesirable behavior. 7. Box root in power, crime, and mystifications. For too long, too many of us have been socialized to see crime and criminal through the eyes of the state. While not everyone will agree with this, it underscores the value of an independent and impartial body taking up the risk of social audit of what is undesirable behavior. Though there is an attempt to impart brevity, the tendency of retaining and adding new offenses tends to offset the advantages. After the Indian Penal Code, many special penal laws have been enacted to deal with new and emerging crimes which could be kept out of the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita. Furthermore, serious crimes such as organized crime and terrorism could be located in existing special laws or a new composite as suggested by the Malimath committee and could handle them. Women and children, it is in consonance with the constitutional vision enshrined in Article 15 Clause 3 special provision for women and children and Article 15(1) a subclause E renounce practices derogatory to the dignity of women. That offences against women and children has been accorded first place in the category of offences in chapter V of the bill, but we get a rude shock when we realize that in the proposed offence of rape under clause 63 sexual intercourse between a man and his wife if the wife is above 18 is not rape. India still seems to be guided by the colonial mindset that is reflected in the clause 359 of the draft penal code 1837, which reads sexual intercourse by a man with his own wife is no longer no case rape. Is no case rape. Likewise, retaining clause 20 and 21 in chapter 3 general exceptions that relate to criminal liberty in a general penal law militates against the philosophy of special law for children that is explicitly laid down in section 1 clause 4 of the Juvenile Justice Act of 2015, notwithstanding anything contained in any other law for the time being is being in force. The provisions of this act shall apply to all matters concerning children in needs of care and protection and children in conflict with law. The proposed penal law has a certain decisive departures from colonial chapter scheme that tried to arrange offences as per the priority of interest of ruling class and pushed the interest of body and property below the offence against the states and other supportive institutions, but the bill has accorded precedence to bodily interest by placing them in chapter VI just before offences against the state. Is it possible to draw some interference from such a shift? The ACD test would lie in the response to the following inquiries. First, will the reforms fulfill the constitutional vision enshrined in Article 13 Clause 2, prohibition of law against fundamental rights? Second, will the law uphold the principles of autonomy and equality? Third, will it further the fraternity guaranteed by the preamble? एक सेकंड के लिए थोड़ा होल्ड कीजिएगा, थोड़ा चेक ही कर लेते हैं कि हो रहा है कि नहीं हो रहा है. सॉरी. देन नेक्स्ट जो है लॉ गवर्निंग फॉरेस्ट ऑफ द नॉर्थ ईस्ट. लॉ गवर्निंग फॉरेस्ट ऑफ द नॉर्थ ईस्ट. In August 2020, the Mizoram Assembly unanimously passed a resolution opposing the Forest Conservation Amendment Act of 2023 to protect the rights and interests of the people of Mizoram. The amendment allows the diversion of the forest and forest land for roads, railway lines of strategic linear projects of national importance and concerning national security within 100 kilometers of India's international border or line of control without a forest clearance under the Forest Conservation Act FCA 1980. Most of India's northeast falls in this 100-kilometer range when it meets next week the Nagaland Assembly will also face strident demands to pass a resolution against the amendment. Tripura, Mizoram and Sikkim, ruled by the Bharatiya Janata Party (BJP) or its allies, have also opposed the 100-kilometer exemption clause. Is FCA application to the Northeast applicable to the Northeast? Special constitutional protections such as the Article 371A of A for Nagaland and 371G for Mizoram prohibit the application of any law enacted by Parliament that impinges on Naga and Mizo customary law and procedure and ownership and transfer of land and its resources. Such laws can be extended to these states only if their legislative assemblies decide. Thus, in a resolution in 1986, Nagaland extended the application of the FCA to government forests and such other forest and wildlife sanctuaries under the control of the state government. The government forests make up only 2.71% of the state's recorded forest area. However, in December 1997, the Home Ministry, in consultation with the Ministry of Law and Justice, confirmed to the Union Environment Ministry that the FCA is covered under the term land resources and is not applicable to Nagaland as its legislative assembly had not adopted any resolution to apply FCA to the state. Later in November 1998, the Environment Ministry contradicted itself when it informed the Nagaland government that FCA is indeed applicable to the states as clarified by Ministry of Law and Justice. Nevertheless, since 1980, the Environment Ministry has not granted an FCA clearance to forest in Nagaland. This is not so with Mizoram. In 1986, the Union Territory became a state with 53rd Amendment of the Constitution, adding Article 371G to the Constitution. It stipulated that all central acts in force before 1986 are extended to the states, including the FCA. Moreover, the powers of the Autonomous District Council in the 3/6 schedule areas in Mizoram do not extend to reserved forest, so the FCA covers 84.53% of the forest area that are notified forest and 6,630 30 have thus far received FCA clearance. Moreover, the FCA is applicable in the rest of the Northeast. In Meghalaya and Tripura, the sixth schedule areas within these states and in Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim and Manipur, Arunachal Pradesh ranked first among these states in FCA clearance 21,786.45 hectare, followed by Tripura 9,051 hectare, Assam 5,261 acres, Manipur 3,604 hectares, Sikkim 2,902 hectares, and Meghalaya 807 hectares. What is RFA? Over a million hectares of forest have been diverted nationwide under FCA since 1980s. FCA exists to deforest the forest under the Indian Forest Act 1927 or its state version in 1996. The Supreme Court expanded the term forest land in FCA in the Godavaram case is not only include forest as understood in the dictionary sense as forest in the government record irrespective of the ownership, thus extending the FCA to unclassed forest. These are recorded forest but not notified as forest. More than half of the northeast is recorded forest area of this 53% unclassed forest controlled by individuals, clan, village council or communities and governed by customary law and procedures. The remainder is notified forest controlled by State Forest Department. RFA ranges from 34.21% in Assam to 82.31% in Sikkim, with Mizoram having 35.48% and Meghalaya 42.34%, Nagaland 53.01%, Arunachal Pradesh 61.55%, Manipur 78.01% and Tripura 60.02% of these unclassed forest range from nil in Sikkim to 97.29% in Nagaland, with 15.47% in Mizoram, 33.43% in Assam, 42.96% in Tripura, 75.67% in Manipur and 88.15% in Meghalaya. The Apex Court's 1996 order brought unclassed forest under the FCS purview. Everywhere there are also forests outside RFA neither recorded nor surveyed. 38.5% of the forest is in Assam, 29% in Nagaland, and 1.5% in Mizoram. What is RFA? What is a FRA Act? It in the Scheduled Tribe and other traditional forest dwellers recognition of Forest Rights Act FRA 2006. Forest land includes unclassified forest under undemarcated forest, existing deemed forest, protected areas, reserved forest, sanctuaries, and national parks. These complied with 1996 Supreme Court redefinitions, while these benefits most northeastern states due to the sizable unclassified forest. FRA also included a specific provision in the list of rights which are recognized under any state law and or laws of any or autonomous district council or autonomous region council, or which are accepted as rights of tribal under any traditional or customary law of the concerned tribes of any state. Nothing prevents these states from taking so motu cognizance of these existing rights and obtaining the concerned Gram Sabha approval for issuing titles. The Ministry of Tribal Affairs can also issue legal enforceable directions under Section 12 of the FRA, paving the way for this. It would add another layer of legal security to traditional community tenurial rights over forest. However, none of the northeastern states have implemented FRA except for Assam and Tripura. The region include the FRA being irrelevant as a communities. Clans chiefs and individuals own most of the land. Their rights are already being enjoyed, and a lack of forest dwellers who are totally forest dependent. While the Mizoram Legislative Assembly resolved on October 29, 2009 under the Article 371G to extend the FRA and its rule with effect from December 31, 2009, it did a U-turn on the November 19, 2019, declaring the FRA not be relevant to the state since no claims for rights were forthcoming. It also referred to the Ministry of Tribal Affairs declining to sanctions 10 lakh to implement the FRA. The Nagaland Assembly is required under Article 371A is yet to decide whether it wants this law. A committee has been looking into it for years now. How can forest then be protected? Environment Ministry mandated FRA implementation and the prior informed consent of the Gram Sabha in 2009 to admit a forest diversion proposal. The responsibility was delegated to the district collector, who ironically also headed the district committee that issue FRA titles. The collector certificate of FRA compliances in principle stage 1 forest clearance was shifted to stage 3 final clearance, but the ministry's 2022 forest conservation rules eliminated compliances with the FRA before final approval altogether. Instead, it is said that state government shall issue order for diversion, assignment or assignment of lease or reservation, as the case may be, after after fulfillment and compliance with the FRA, including ensuring settlement of rights. Taking this further, states can formulate and take legal measures to ensure mandatory fulfillment of the FRA before recommending a forest diversion proposal and ensuring Gram Sabha consent before handling over forest land. The Ministry of Tribal Affairs can also issue legal enforceable directions under the FRA or even enact a separate law to recognize and settle forest rights when forests are diverted for other purposes and forest dwellers are reallocated as forest rights fall squarely within its business rules. This way, The states and the tribal affair ministry have a way to provide a tenurial security to forest dwellers and protect the forest. तो नेक्स्ट आर्टिकल है इंडो पैसिफिक चाइना मैप्स ऑन एजेंडा एज पीएम लीव्स फॉर जाकार्ता. ये दूसरा आर्टिकल है मोदी बाइडेन टू होल्ड बायलैटरल टॉक्स ऑन फ्राइडे अकॉर्डिंग टू व्हाइट हाउस. ये दोनों ही आर्टिकल हम लोग देख लेते हैं एक ही स्लाइड में. Future cooperation on Indo-Pacific trade issues, the situation in Myanmar and the recent controversy over the China's map are likely to be on the agenda as Prime Minister Narendra Modi leaves on Wednesday for a two-day visit to Jakarta to attend the annual ASEAN-India Summit and the East Asia Summit hosted by Indonesia President Joko Widodo. The visit is seen as a diplomatic gesture to Indonesia as Mr. Modi was originally reluctant to travel just before the G20 summit and the arrival of the US President Joseph Biden to Delhi, whom he is scheduled to meet on Friday, as well as other G20 leaders. However, after India conveyed its concern, Indonesian officials rescheduled both summits to be convened back-to-back on Thursday morning with only a short break in between. During the ASEAN-India summit, the first since the two sides upgraded their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2022. Mr. Modi will review progress on issues such as strategic cooperations and military exercises, as well as connectivity, including physical, digital, and people-to-people ties. Saurav Kumar, Secretary East External Affairs Minister said. He said that while ASEAN-India trade ties would be reviewed, plans to revise the ASEAN-India trade in goods agreement would be taken up by the ministerial dialogue. Asked if the recent controversy over China's publication of a map that angered India and several other neighbors could also come up, Mr. Kumar was non-committal. It is difficult to anticipate what will be discussed when the leaders meet, but issues which are mutual concern, regional and international, would also come up in their discussion. Whether there would be consensus, I cannot anticipate, he said. Mr. Modi will begin the day on Thursday with the ASEAN India Summit with leaders of 10 Southeast Asian countries, of which Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei have all issued statements conveying concerns over China's depiction of their territories in its standard map. 2023 is issued last week as India head. He will then attend the East Asian Summit with the leaders of the ASEAN 10, US Vice President Kamala Harris, Chinese President Li Qiang, and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He will return to Delhi the same day ahead of arrivals for G20, many of whom will fly from Jakarta, while Russian President Vladimir Putin, Chinese President Xi Jinping, and Mexican President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador have regretted their attendance at the summit in Delhi on September 9 and 10. Various health concerns threw uncertainty on Tuesday over US President Joe Biden, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Brazilian President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva, all of whom have confirmed their participations. Then Modi Biden to hold bilateral talks on Friday, according to White House. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Joe Biden will hold bilateral talks on Friday in New Delhi. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan confirmed Mr. Biden, who is being closely watched for symptoms of COVID-19 after US First Lady Jill Biden tested positive on Monday, tested negative on Wednesday, and is still on track to travel to India for the G20 summit. As per the White House in New Delhi, the US will focus on delivering for developing countries, making progress on key priorities for the American people, from climate to technology, and showing our commitment to G20. Mr. Sullivan told reporters at Tuesday's White House press briefing. He said the US welcomed the addition of the African Union as a new permanent member of the G20, and that scaling up and reshaping development banks and institutions, the World Bank and IMF, would also be focus of the discussion this weekend. Mr. Biden will call the G20 countries to provide debt relief for low and middle income countries and play a constructive in this with no exception. Mr. Sullivan said, presumably referring to China's role as the world's largest creditor. Other issues on the agenda, the G20, as per the Sullivan, include the inclusive digital transformation, the responsible use of artificial intelligence, climate and digital technology, and infrastructure investment. Mr. Biden will also call for a just and durable peace for Ukraine and respect for United Nations character and international law following Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Joint statement. Mr. Sullivan acknowledged that getting consensus on a G20 statement on Russia's invasion of Ukraine was going to be challenging because Russia is a part of Russia is a part of the G20, albeit not at the New Delhi summit. India's G20 Sherpa for top official Amitabh Kant is still hopeful of a joint declaration. The Financial Times reported earlier this week, despite objection by Beijing and Moscow on language, and Ukraine borrowed from last year's summit in Bali. In July, however, Mr. Kant had said that the Russia-Ukraine war was not a priority for India's G20 presidency, but it was working instead of a leaders declaration focused on issues such as development, multilateral institution, and technological transformation. During Tuesday's press briefing, Mr. Sullivan assured the US press of access during the G20 after he was asked if the press traveling with Mr. Biden to Asia, India, and then Vietnam should expect challenges such as the threat and restrictions. Then Xi Jinping skipping G20 summit, a deliberate signal to India, according to West. The decision by Chinese President conveys Beijing displeasure with the current state of bilateral ties with New Delhi and with what it sees as the politici- politicization of G20 with China believes should be limited to economic issues, says experts. Due to an urgent work, I am just showing you the paper view of this and not I am not able to read out all the paper view. So kindly go through it and I will read out only this one, the major one. India's Bharat interchangeable can be used in official invite, say legal expert. An official invitation from President Draupadi Murmu to G20 guest in which she is described as the President of Bharat has triggered speculations that Narendra Modi government could officially change the names of India to Bharat during the 5-day long special session of Parliament that starts on September 18. While the issue has predictably sent political temperature soaring, there is ambivalence within the legal fraternity on whether a constitutional amendment is required for a change of name. The fact is that the terms Bharat and India can be used interchangeably, especially in view of authorized Hindi version of the Indian Constitution. But the government can not stipulate that everyone use only the name. Either is permissible or usable interchangeable. Senior Supreme Court advocate and Congress member Abhishek Sanghvi told the Hindu. Mr. Sanghvi, who is also a former chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Law and Justice, said an amendment would be required only if the government insisted on the use of any one term of or wanted to remove a particular term. Former additional solicitor general and senior supreme court advocate Aman Lekhi said it was officially the Republic of India and even the G20 presidency was known as the Indian presidency. He said that any change of the name would be required a constitutional amendment under Article 368. The change is possible, but is it necessary? There are certain things that should be freed of controversy, and the name of the country should highest in the list. Mr. Lekhi said. Unless any intention to the contrary is made explicit, the terminology is only a question of semantics, and as this stage there is no need to read anything sinister. Former Law Minister Ashwini Kumar said. Another top of constitutional expert who did not wish to be named said there was nothing wrong in sending an invitation as President of Bharat. However, it should not be seen as the first step towards doing away with the use of English language. Article 348, Clause 1 of the Constitution states that all the proceedings in the Supreme Court and in every High Court shall be in English language until Parliament passes a law. The expert noted, adding, if they want to pass such a law, then that would be a federal issue. The debate over the language of government bills started last month after Union Home Minister Amit Shah introduced the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, the Bharatiya Nagarik Suraksha Sanhita, and the Bharatiya Sakshya bill in Lok Sabha to replace the Indian Penal Code of Criminal Procedure, and the Evidence Act, respectively. How two CGI 4 years apart had dealt differently with the pleas for the name भारत. ये थोड़ा पढ़ लीजिएगा यहाँ से पॉज करके. In second action by Aistrak, Aditya L1 enters a new orbit. ये भी थोड़ा आप देख लीजिएगा. Due to some unavoidable reason, I am not able to go forward. ये थोड़ा देख लेना आप लोग आज के लिए खाली. FM flags threat to financial system from crypto tax haven. एक अच्छा आर्टिकल है, ये कर लेना चाहिए था लेकिन क्या करें, हो नहीं पा रहा है. क्रिमिनलाइजिंग willful environmental damage is harder than it sounds. चलिए मैं ये वाला पिछले वाला आर्टिकल थोड़ा पढ़ लेता हूँ क्योंकि बहुत ज़्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट है इसलिए. PM flags threats to financial system from crypto tax havens. In G20 presidency call for a framework for handling issues relating to crypto assets. FM also urges fintech industry to guard against threats. Union Finance and Corporate Affairs Minister Nirmala Sitharaman on Tuesday said cryptocurrencies, drug mafias, tax havens, and cyber intrusion posed a major threat to the global financial ecosystem, and a global collaborative efforts was needed to counter such challenges. We should be well sized of the threat of which conventional welfare of threats and other threats such as cyber threat, crypto threats as far it is an opportunity, it is also a threat. Also, threat is a threat of drugs, drug wars, and drug mafias, tax havens, round tripping of resources, and tax evasion. We need to work on all these so that we can address them. Mrs. Sitaraman said while addressing delegates and the at the Global FinTech Fest GFF 2023, which is underway in Mumbai. She said understanding these global challenges would help in building a resilient financial ecosystem, urging the fintech industry to guard against these threats. The minister asked these firms to invest heavily to counter cyber threats. We need to have fintech companies to invest heavily in robust security measures, utilizing advanced encryption and other measures to protect user also, data and financial transactions. A secured system is what will build trust, and therefore it is a must for the financial ecosystem. She said, India can lead in making the financial ecosystem inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. We have the tools, but we have to make it responsible. That is why we need global cooperation, she added, emphasizing that India's priority was to have an enhanced cross-border payment arrangement considering the volume of the remittances to the country. She said one of the priority area for the G20 under India's presidency was sharing of information and seeking cooperation. She said consultative papers were being discussed on various issues on crypto. The International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the Financial Stability Board has released their synthesis paper. The minister added, underlying the important roles of the fintech industry in building a responsible financial ecosystem. She said, fintechs in India were driving more inclusion and influencing India's financial ecosystem. Today, fintech has been become a robust and dynamic financial inclusion tool, according to a 2022 BCG Matrix report in a leading lending, which is one of the core businesses of the banks. Fintechs had 36% share of new to credit customers versus 22% share of brick and mortar banks. Fintech are reaching out far more, even in lending, an area which is a conventional bank functions, Mr. Sitaraman said. तो नेक्स्ट जो है, criminalizing willful environmental damage is harder than it sounds. ये थोड़ा जूम आउट करके कर देता हूँ आप लोगों के लिए. ताकि आप लोग पढ़ सको, क्योंकि मैं अभी एक इम्पोर्टेंट काम से जा रहा हूँ, अभी रह नहीं पाऊंगा अभी यहाँ पर, इसलिए थोड़ा प्रॉब्लम हो सकती है। तो आप थोड़ा पॉज करके देख लेना, है ना। So thank you everyone. We will continue from tomorrow onwards. Thank you.